A quiet night on the road turns into a chilling test of power and survival when Naomi Carter, a high-ranking FBI director, is pulled over without cause. But this is no routine stop. A white officer, armed with prejudice and a loaded gun, is determined to assert control. What he doesn't realize is that Naomi isn't just another driver. She's a force of justice. The moment he reaches for his holster, the night takes a turn that will shake the nation. Naomi Carter rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Another long day at the office, another stack of unsolved cases, another reminder that justice was never as simple as it should be. She grabbed her coat, taking a final glance at the dimly lit office before stepping out into the night. The cool evening air wrapped around her as she slid into the driver's seat of her black SUV. The familiar hum of the engine was almost soothing, a contrast to the relentless chaos of her work. She exhaled, gripping the wheel, her eyes scanning the empty road ahead. The suburban streets were quiet, bathed in the golden glow of streetlights. Shadows stretched across the pavement, flickering in the distance as she drove. It was rare, this moment of solitude. For once, there were no ringing phones, no urgent meetings, no agents waiting for orders. Just the road, the silence, and the promise of home. Then, red and blue lights flooded the night. A siren cut through the stillness, sharp and commanding. Naomi's breath hitched as she glanced at her speedometer. The numbers were steady. No violations, no sudden turns. Nothing that justified those flashing lights. Her grip tightened on the wheel. She flicked her eyes to the rearview mirror. The patrol car loomed behind her, its presence heavy, expectant. Her stomach twisted in a way she hadn't felt in years. She knew exactly what this was. A slow exhale. Stay calm. Naomi had spent her life upholding the law, dedicating herself to justice. But tonight, none of that would matter. The badge she carried, the title she held, meaningless in the face of this reality. She was just another black woman behind the wheel, and that was enough. She forced herself to breathe, though the weight in her chest grew heavier. If this was happening to her, what happened to those without power? How many times had she seen cases like this? Heard the stories, watched the evidence unfold, and now she was in it. The frustration simmered beneath her skin, coiling tight in her muscles, but she pushed it down. Emotion wouldn't save her here. Logic would. She slowed the car, carefully pulling to the side of the road. Every movement was deliberate. No sudden gestures, no misinterpretation. Her fingers hovered over the dashboard camera. Click, recording. Then her phone. She set it in place, ensuring the lens captured everything. Not because she had anything to hide, but because she knew she had to prove she didn't. The engine idled softly, a stark contrast to the rising tension in the air. Naomi's heart pounded, but she remained still, controlled. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating and undeniable. Then, the car door behind her creaked open. A dark silhouette emerged, stepping forward, slow and intentional. Naomi inhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't just another traffic stop. Tonight, she wouldn't just be an enforcer of the law. Tonight, she would be a target. The sound of heavy boots striking pavement filled the silence. Each step deliberate, slow, measured. Naomi Carter kept her eyes on the side mirror, tracking the officer's approach. The man's face was unreadable, but she didn't need to see his expression to recognize the hostility radiating from him. She had seen this before, too many times. Officer Ethan Walker walked with authority, an authority that came not just from his badge, but from something more dangerous. His eyes, cold and assessing, locked on her car like she was already guilty of something. Then she saw it, his right hand, resting too close to the gun at his hip. Not drawn, not yet, but close enough. Close enough to send a message. Naomi inhaled deeply, keeping her movements deliberate. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread. A silent gesture. I am not a threat. Not that it mattered. The air inside the SUV felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. He hadn't said a word, and already the tension was suffocating. Then, his voice cut through the quiet. License and registration. Clipped. Commanding. Not a request. A demand. Naomi turned her head, meeting his gaze through the open window. Her voice was calm, controlled. "Can you tell me why I was stopped, officer?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face, just for a second. He hadn't expected that. "You look suspicious." Her grip tightened on the wheel. There was the excuse. She exhaled slowly, the heat of anger curling in her chest. The words were as predictable as they were baseless. Suspicious. Driving home after work. Suspicious. Obeying every traffic law. Naomi refused to let the anger show. That was what men like him wanted. An excuse. She didn't give him one. "Look suspicious." Her voice didn't waver. "That is not a lawful reason for a stop." Ethan's jaw tensed. His patience thinned. With an impatient grunt, his palm slammed against the door of her SUV. The sound cracked through the night like a gunshot. Naomi didn't flinch. His eyes darkened. "Are you carrying drugs?" he asked. Silence. "Weapons." Naomi didn't react, but she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. Then, the words she knew were coming. "People like you are always involved in shady things." A slow, twisting sickness settled in her stomach. She knew exactly what was happening now. This wasn't about the law. This wasn't about any traffic violation. This was about power. Naomi had handled criminals. She had looked killers in the eye. And yet, in this moment, the reality of it all hit her like a fist to the ribs. It didn't matter who she was. Her rank, her service, none of it mattered. Because to him, she was just a black woman behind the wheel. And that was enough. She could feel the weight of every untold story, every name that had turned into a headline. But she wasn't going to be a headline. Not tonight. She stayed still, controlled, unshaken. And that was what pushed Ethan Walker over the edge. His patience snapped like a brittle thread. Authority, in his mind, should never be questioned. His hand darted toward his holster. In one swift motion, he drew his firearm. The metallic click of the gun, leaving leather scent, iced down Naomi's spine. The cold steel glinted under the streetlights. The barrel aimed directly at her face. The world slowed to a crawl. Her breath steadied. One wrong move could end everything. Naomi's mind sharpened. Instincts taking over like a switch had been flipped. Years of training, countless crisis situations, endless drills. She had been prepared for moments like this. But preparation didn't erase the reality of it. The gun was pointed at her, and the wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. She controlled her breathing, slow and steady. Every action, every word, had to be deliberate, non-threatening, calculated. The silence between them was thick, charged with something dangerous. The night itself seemed heavier, the stillness suffocating. Naomi's hands remained firm on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, visible. It was second nature now, a simple act of survival. Even with fear pressing against her ribs, she refused to show it. She sat still, controlled, expression unreadable. Then, the command came. "Step out of the car. Now." Ethan Walker's voice was sharp, unyielding. His grip on the gun tightened. Naomi didn't move. She had seen this before. She knew exactly what he was doing. Her pulse remained steady. Her expression never wavered. "I do not feel safe exiting my vehicle." Her voice was even, measured. Ethan's jaw clenched. "You have no legal right to order me out," she continued, her tone unwavering. The words hit him like a challenge, and his face darkened. Authority, power, control. These were things men like him thrived on. And right now, he felt all of them slipping away. His anger flared, hot and immediate, like a lit match touching gasoline. She could see it, the way frustration twisted his expression, how his grip on the gun flexed, his breathing coming sharper now. His voice rose, threats thinly veiled behind his words. "You're resisting an officer of the law." He spat the words out like a final warning, daring her to give in. Naomi knew better. She knew this game. He was hoping fear would do the work for him. That intimidation would force her into submission. But fear had never controlled her before, and it wouldn't now. She inhaled deeply, slow, controlled. Then, she moved, deliberately, purposefully. Her hand lifted, slow and steady, reaching for the phone mounted on her dashboard. One tap. She turned the screen toward him. It was streaming live, straight to the FBI database. Every word, every movement, every threat, captured, recorded, unchangeable. The reaction was instant. Ethan stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the screen, scanning the glaring red live icon. The arrogance in his gaze wavered. A flash of realization. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This wasn't just another black woman he could intimidate. He hesitated. A single moment of doubt. His mind worked quickly, calculating the damage. A national scandal. Career destruction. Possible prison time. For the first time, he looked uncertain. But then, something else flashed in his eyes. His ego refusing to let him back down. Not yet. A sharp wail sliced through the thick silence, piercing the night like a blade. Naomi didn't flinch. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, drowning out the tension that had been suffocating the air. Flashing red and blue lights exploded across the scene, throwing shadows against the pavement. The backup had arrived. Ethan Walker's posture stiffened. He hadn't expected this. He had expected control, submission, silence. Instead, scrutiny had arrived, and with it, a force he could not ignore. The patrol car came to an abrupt stop, dust swirling in the glow of headlights. The driver's door swung open with force. Sheriff Robert Hayes stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. The man was seasoned, grit and experience carved into every line on his face. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the sight before him. Naomi Carter, sitting calmly, powerfully behind the wheel. Ethan Walker, standing rigid, gun drawn, eyes burning with something between fear and denial. Recognition flickered in the sheriff's gaze. His expression hardened. Something cold crawled up Ethan's spine. His grip on his weapon loosened, but his pride refused to let him fully process the truth. His face drained of color. He had just held a high-ranking FBI director at gunpoint, and now, he wasn't the one in control. The sheriff marched forward, each step deliberate. His gaze locked onto Ethan, unblinking, unwavering. His voice was low but edged with undeniable fury. "Do you know who you just threatened, Walker?" Ethan stammered, words failing him. Naomi watched as the authority he had once wielded slipped through his fingers like sand. He had demanded control. Now he was grasping at the last remains of it, and finding nothing left to hold on to. Naomi unclicked her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Her movements were calm, commanding, unshaken. She stood tall, the quiet power of her presence shifting the atmosphere. Ethan's confidence crumbled before her. "Sheriff," she said, her voice unwavering. "This officer violated the law and must be held accountable." She wasn't pleading. She was stating a fact. Sheriff Hayes didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His eyes remained locked on Ethan. "Put the gun down, Walker." The order was absolute, non-negotiable, final. Ethan hesitated. His fingers twitched. The weight of the gun in his grip had never felt heavier. For a brief second, Naomi saw it, the battle in his eyes. Ego versus survival. Control versus consequence. Then, with a last bitter glance at her, Ethan lowered his weapon. His hands were slow, reluctant, defeated. He unclipped the holster, sliding his gun free, before handing it over. The air shifted. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. For the first time that night, Ethan Walker was no longer in control. Naomi reached into her car, retrieving her phone. She turned the screen towards Sheriff Hayes. Every second of this was recorded. Her expression remained unreadable, but the message was clear. There was no escaping justice now. Ethan Walker stood frozen, his mind still struggling to grasp the weight of what had just happened. The badge, the very thing that had given him unchecked power, was now being ripped away. His once pristine uniform felt like a costume now, a hollow shell of authority as he stood under the harsh glow of police lights. A fellow officer reached for his weapon, unfastening the holster and pulling it free. Ethan didn't resist. He couldn't. His hands clenched at his sides as the reality hit him. He was no longer in control, no longer the law. As he was led away, his expression twisted with shock, with resentment, with something dangerously close to fear. But it didn't matter anymore. His power had been stripped away, piece by piece, and Naomi Carter had made sure of it. Naomi refused to let this be just another headline, another moment of outrage that faded into silence. This wasn't just about her. This was about every single person who had been in her position but never had a camera, never had proof, never had the power to fight back. She picked up the phone and called the only people who could make sure this moment would mean something. federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, lawmakers who had spent years pushing for change, but lacked the evidence that now sat in the palm of her hand. "This is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "This is a symptom of a broken system, and I won't stop until it's exposed." The footage hit the airwaves like a tidal wave. Within hours, news networks had picked up the video, broadcasting the damning evidence across the country. A white officer pulling a gun on a black woman. A black woman who was not just any woman, but an FBI director. The nation erupted. Protests formed overnight. Angry voices demanding accountability. Ethan Walker's face was everywhere, a symbol of unchecked power and the reckoning that was long overdue. The precinct tried to control the damage, issuing a brief, carefully worded statement. But the public wasn't listening. Not this time. Civil rights groups, legal experts, and community leaders took to the streets. Outside the police station, voices rose in unison. No justice, no peace. The pressure mounted. The system that had protected officers like Walker for decades was suddenly under a microscope. Lawmakers, once hesitant to challenge the police unions, now had thousands of signatures landing on their desks. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a movement. Ethan Walker sat in a courtroom, his face set in stone, as cameras flashed around him. The charges read out like a list of every abuse of power he had ever thought he'd get away with. Abuse of authority, racial profiling, endangering the life of a civilian. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Reporters, activists, lawmakers, people who wanted to see him fall. His attorneys scrambled, grasping for any justification, any excuse. But there was none. The footage was undeniable. The truth was right there, playing on every screen in the country. Naomi stepped onto the witness stand. The room fell silent. She looked at the jury, then at the judge, then, finally, at Ethan. Her voice was steady, deliberate. If a director of the FBI can be targeted, imagine the everyday citizens who have no voice. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of her words settled like a heavy stone in the air. She had walked into this courtroom as a victim, but she would walk out as something more. An advocate, a fighter, a woman who refused to be silenced. 3 days. That's how long it took for the jury to decide his fate. Then, finally, the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Some gasped. Some wept. Some simply nodded because this moment was something they had been waiting for their entire lives. A judge looked Walker in the eye and gave him what no police officer had ever expected. 4 years in prison. The weight of those words sent a ripple through the courtroom, through the city, through the country. A police officer was going to prison for his abuse of power, and the world was watching. This wasn't just a case. It was a turning point. For too long, the system had protected those who wielded power instead of serving justice. Not this time. And Naomi Carter? She wasn't finished. The courtroom victory was just the beginning. She took the fight beyond the headlines, working alongside lawmakers to push for police reform. New policies, new oversight, new protections to ensure this would never happen again. The world watched as change began to take shape. Because one woman refused to back down. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and a sea of faces turned toward the woman standing at the podium. Naomi Carter adjusted the microphone, her hands steady, her expression resolute. This was it. The weight of this moment pressed against her, heavy with expectation. But she didn't flinch. She had faced death. She had stared down a gun barrel. She had survived injustice, and now she was here to make sure no one else had to. She looked out over the crowd, past the reporters, past the flashing lights, and into the eyes of a nation that was watching, waiting, hoping. She took a breath, and then she spoke. This is bigger than one officer. Her voice was clear, sharp as steel. This is bigger than one arrest, one trial, one guilty verdict. This is about a system that allows people in power to abuse that power. A system that protects them, shields them, and silences the people they oppress. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Naomi leaned in, her tone unwavering. That stops today. She called for reform, for laws that held law enforcement accountable, for independent oversight, for real change, not just words, not just promises, but action. Her words were like a match against dry paper. Sparks flew. The fire spread. Within hours, the speech was everywhere. News anchors replayed it. The world took notice. The demand for reform became deafening. Lawmakers scrambled to respond. New policies were drafted. Mandatory racial sensitivity training was introduced. Oversight committees gained traction. For the first time in a long time, it felt like things were shifting. But Naomi knew better. This was a step forward, not the finish line. She left the press conference, exhaustion settling into her bones. As she drove through the quiet city streets, she let herself reflect, not just as an FBI director, not just as a black woman who had been targeted by the very system she worked to uphold, but as a survivor. She had proven that even those in power had to answer for their actions. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There were still names that hadn't been spoken, still cases that hadn't been solved, still families waiting for justice that might never come. She tightened her grip on the wheel. This wasn't just her fight. It belonged to every person who had ever been silenced. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. She owed it to them, to the people who had come before her, to the people who would come after. As she pulled in her driveway, she grabbed her phone, opened her live feed, and spoke one last time. If you believe in justice, share this story. She paused. And don't forget to subscribe for more meaningful stories, because the fight for justice never ends.